Thanks very much. I don't know how many people were here earlier to hear Emery Douglas. Quite a lot, I imagine. And that's good because what I'm going to do is just take off, I hope, sort of from where Emery was or where Emery left off, because it struck me as I listened to him, all the while he was speaking, little sort of connections began to spark in my mind. Times when I knew Emery slightly, ever so slightly, before today. In fact, just outside a couple of hours ago, I was walking along, coming towards this building. And then he said, "Hey!" And I looked right, and it was Emery who gave me a hug. And I thought he remembered me, and it's a good thing I'm here because I was going to go home at that point. Because I thought it's not going to get any better than this. You know, Emery Douglas recognises me and gives me a hug. And some of the things he said struck me immediately, that I know what's connected to that. Sort of not the things that he was talking about, the things that it connected me with, to listen to him. And one of them was, you recall, if you were here, he showed that iconic picture from the Mexico Olympics of 1968. Brother Carlos and Brother William with their fists in the air, after coming first and third in the 100 meters. You know, and that reminded me, obviously, of the Mexico Olympics, but more than that, the relevance of the Mexican Olympics, the Mexico City Olympics, the connection between that and the civil rights struggle in Northern Ireland. And that might not be immediately apparent. In fact, it's not immediately apparent to anybody other than about half a dozen of us, from Derry. The most accounts of the Northern Ireland Troubles, as we call them, begin from October the 5th, 1968. That was the day of the first Civil Rights March. It was in Derry. There had been little marches before that, but this was the first march that became contentious and that made any impact on the public consciousness in Northern Ireland or anywhere else. And the reason for that was that the march was attacked by the police, by the Royal Ulster Constabulary, was beaten off the streets, and then they moved in with water cannon and so forth. Unluckily for them, the strange thing about the media and the way things work, there was one television camera person there from Radio Telefi Sheridan, which is the Southern Irish television station. It's interesting to speculate at how much smaller the impact would have been had there not been those pictures. Because by 6 o'clock that night, they were not only on RTE, it was the lead story on the BBC National News and the Independent Television National News, which are the two big channels in the part of the world that I come from. And one reason for that, I'm a journalist myself, and I know that one of the abiding sins of journalism is that if there's good pictures, it gets prominence. And sometimes there's terrific stories of enormous human interest and of enormous importance, but if there's no pictures to go with them, there's no graphics to make them dramatic to a reader, they get downplayed. Whereas you'll know that yourself from looking at newspapers on the front page. They were always on the lookout for a good picture. So if I was once the news editor of a national paper, I know how important it is. I used to select the pictures. And there were terrific pictures from that day, one in particular that went round the world, which was of a water cannon, with a gush of water coming in an arc and coming down and hitting a man, right on the face. And he's got his hand up like this in a Nazi salute. It was a brilliant picture, because it summed up everything that had happened. A picture can really tell more than 1,000 words, and that picture did. And that made all the newspapers and all the television bulletins, and that's one of the reasons why it was October the 5th and not something that happened the next month or the month after that, which sparked not only the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, as a major event, because of course people like being seen. This is something that might sound like trivia, and it probably is trivia. But when people see themselves on the national news, it gives them the idea, and it is, in fact, this is important. People are paying attention to us. That in itself is demoralizing when you're doing things sometimes and nobody pays the slightest bit of attention to you. So all this was terribly important. And that picture, for example, from the Mexican Olympics, in the 100 meters, anybody know off the top of their heads who won any other event in 1968? Anybody? I don't, and I'm a sports nut. But I can't remember anybody else. I remember that. Why do I remember that? Because of that picture. That's what reminds us of it. You see, another thing happened during the period when the Mexico Olympics were on. It was this, that taking advantage, or trying to take advantage, of the fact that Mexico City was infested with journalists at the time, and students at the university in Mexico City held a number of protests and barricaded the campus and so forth, and the cops moved in, and there were, I forget the actual number, but certainly there were in excess of 20 students killed. It's a massacre. It's a massacre. That had happened. Now, on October the 5th, the civil rights demonstration, we marched up. There's only about 400 people on the demonstration. If you go back to Derry now and talk to people and ask were you on the October 5th demonstration, you would think there were so many people that it's amazing that the carriageway didn't collapse. There actually were about 400 of us on this, because there were sort of lefties and eccentrics and so forth. We had organised this thing. So as we marched along a street called Duke Street, in the waterside area of Derry. We're going to start there at a railway station, march up Duke Street, across the bridge, sort of into the part of the town where, into the city centre, and hold a rally there. And the cops were right across the mouth of Duke Street, so we couldn't get through at first. So naturally, what happens in that type of situation? Somebody produced a chair and a megaphone, and the meeting started. In the middle of every riot in Northern Ireland, there's somebody with a megaphone waiting for the meeting to start. I mean, it's probably the same everywhere. But instead of this little meeting, there was a couple of people got up to speak, and there was tension in the air, and a lot of unruliness and pushing and shouting and so on. And the first couple of speakers counselled caution and peace and all the rest of it. And I was the next speaker, and I recall that I stepped up on a chair, a little ordinary table, a chair that you would sit down to have your tea with. And I remember standing up at that, and I didn't know what to say. I had no clue. I remember very well standing there for about 5, 7, 8 seconds, which is a long time to stand in front of the crowd. Really is a long time. So I'm wondering, what am I going to say? Because I mean, if I had said something like charge the cops or something like that, the enormous responsibility sort of would be on me to do that. But at the same time, I wasn't going to do what the previous couple of speakers had done and say, congratulations everybody on having come here, now go home. Because we don't want any violence sullying our movement, do we? That was a constant mantra at the time. Violence will discredit us. We don't want any violence, do we? So I didn't want to be saying that either. And as I was standing there, sort of lost for words, there came a shout from the crowd. And it was, what about the Mexican students, McCann? And again, this voice shouted, what about the Mexican students, McCann? And I looked down and I saw this guy who shouted. He's about 14 years old, maybe 15. So red hair, round face, thick glasses, and I recognised him. I was a member of the Labour Party Young Socialists. It's called Mickey Devine. I had Mickey, and I knew immediately what he meant. He meant was, here we are, now the Mexican students could stand up to the cops and be massacred. Are we going to stand here and take this and just go home again, nothing accomplished? And that's what sparked me off. And then I made a speech which was litter characterised in the magistrate's court as incitement to violence. I wasn't really inciting anybody to violence, but I was convicted of that. I got 6 months. I never served it because for reasons, at the time I went to, no, I won't have time, I won't go into. Anyway, we all got amnesty, everybody who had been sentenced in an attempt to buy off the civil rights movement a few months later. We're all amnesty, so I never served any of the 6 months. You see, and the point is, and this is on a number of occasions when Emery was speaking, I began to think on things, and then it struck me they're all circular. They all come back. And one of the things about Mickey Devine was this, that Mickey, a member of the Derry Labour Party Young Socialists, as they say, then he, as tension mounted and events spiralled, he joined the official IRA. That was one. There's a number of IRAs around at the time. A number of IRAs around at the minute. There's always more than one IRA, each of them claiming with dogmatic certainty that they are the real IRA and that all the other IRAs are phony claimants to the mantle. People on the left, like ourselves, will recognise, perhaps, this pattern of thought. I think he joined the official IRA, and then the official IRA naturally split. And Mickey was now in the Irish National Liberation Army, the INLA. I remember a number of debates with Mickey urging him not to go down the paramilitary path, that this wasn't the way forward. I still believe that. I believe he was mistaken. I believe they all were mistaken. A number of bruising sort of encounters. Many of them, most of them have remained my friends. So down through the years, those who have survived. And Mickey joined the INLA. He was caught, sort of captured, while out on a job, out on a mission, and was sentenced to, I think it was 14 years in prison. Mickey went on hunger strike. He was the last of the hunger strikers today, the 10th hunger striker today. At that stage, obviously the 10 had died already. The thing was, to be honest, petering out a bit. Because when Bobby Sands died, the first person to die on a hunger strike, it was a cataclysm across the north. And indeed, it made a big impact around the world. By the time it came to Mickey, things had become about 1 a month was dying. And sad to say, but this is the way of the world. You know, sort of a repetition sort of dulls the sensitivities of everybody to particular events. But nevertheless, when Mickey died in hunger strike, it had an impact everywhere. There used to be, sort of, it probably is the case, I probably don't read the left press as closely as I should these days, but in all the left newspapers at the time, you would see sort of little one-paragraph stories down maybe a column on the right-hand side, which were little snippets from around the world. You know, Cairo, bus strike, attacked by the police. California, grape pickers go on strike again. And so little things like that. And there was one there that said, I remember, it wasn't Socialist Worker, I can't remember what a paper it was, and I would have been associated even then with the Socialist Worker paper. What it said was, Mexico City had said that students at the campus of Mexico City University had gathered and stood for a minute's silence for the death of the Irish hunger striker Mickey Devine. All those years later, it had come round again. So I had almost forgotten about that until Emery was speaking. Sort of, and he said at an early part of his talk, he mentioned the Mexico Olympics and showed that iconic photograph. And I suddenly remembered Mickey Devine. That's what that reminds me of. And I thought, I start with that. You know, sort of, and then sort of as I was thinking on afterwards, and other things struck me about that. When I said there's some little connection, very fragile and distant connection with Emery before, it is that sort of when the civil rights movement began, it was very popular. You know, people liked it. One of the most popular people in these islands, those of you of a certain age, sort of, I say these islands, I mean, I'm talking about Britain and Ireland. Here I am on the side of these islands. Shows you how sort of narrow-minded and self-centred we are over there. Sort of that we never really leave. I've met a few people over the last couple of days here who haven't really left. You know, a number of Scottish people here, I mean, who never really left Scotland. Which is fine, I mean, it's if you come from Scotland, you've no choice really in the matter. It's just a sad circumstance. But anyway, sort of, the civil rights movement was very popular around the world. You know, very popular among Irish Australians. You know, sort of used to get things, and the odd person used to go out and make speeches and over here. It was very popular in the United States with the Irish American community. Very popular indeed. They collected loads of money. Money used to come. And to be honest, it was a terrible thing to say. They used to collect money in solidarity and send it over to Derry. And we didn't know what to do with it. You know, we think, well, we can't send it back. That would be very rude. You know. But actually, we weren't actually starving. You know what I mean? Sort of, anyway, I don't know what we did with it. We made posters or something. It wasn't stolen. But anyway, it's that's just in case there's any Irish Americans here who contributed at that time and who are wondering ever since what happened to my $10. You know, it didn't go to waste. We did something constructive with it. But among the people who were like, we used to go out, there's people going out from Derry, out to speak, put on meetings, the Irish Americans, to go out and do little tours, sort of Philadelphia and Boston and so forth. I remember my good friend Bernadette Devlin, as he then was. Bernadette was elected as the youngest MP in the history of the British Parliament. I think she still holds that title. Yes, she does. She was only 21. She was about 21 and 6 months when she was elected. So Bernadette sort of was invited out to the States, and she went out, and we watched her progress in newspaper reports and the odd television thing and so forth. And one of the things she did, well, she did a number of very good things there. A man called Richard Daley, he was an Irish American, very conscious of his Irish roots, was the mayor of Chicago. Sort of, and of course, as soon as Bernadette arrived in Illinois, sort of with great sort of pomp and ceremony, he organised at City Hall, he organised a reception. She was going to be given some scroll or something or other, and she refused to go because what the Chicago cops had been doing to the Black Panthers. This wasn't long after Emery mentioned Fred Hampton. Sort of, he was murdered in Chicago. He was actually in his own apartment, and the cops came and pumped bullets into the apartment when he didn't open the door. And Emery explained some of the reasons why they weren't opening the doors to cops who didn't have warrants. So they emptied loads of bullets in and killed Fred Hampton. I had the great honour of meeting his son just last year when he came to Ireland. So Bernadette says, no, I'm not going to meet Mayor Daley. And that didn't make her any more popular, made her somewhat less popular with Irish Americans. Then she continued her tour. Then she went to New York, and she did something that she shouldn't have done. She actually met a man called John Lindsay. Don't know how many people remember John Lindsay. He was the mayor of New York. It was a very rare thing. He was a liberal Republican. So the big man, about 6'6" high, which, funnily enough, and I now come to think about the present mayor of New York, is 6'6" high. That's got absolutely nothing to do with what I'm talking about, but it just occurred to me. Anyway, she met, I know the reason why, and I remember a picture of Mayor Lindsay and Bernadette sort of on the steps of City Hall or whatever it is in New York, which is strange, very strange. Bernadette was only 5 foot exactly. I mean, she was a little tiny thing, and he was 6'6". And there they were, so that looked a bit sort of daft and so on. But even dafter was the fact that in the middle of the mass murders of the Panthers and so on, Mayor Lindsay presented her with the golden key to New York, sort of the freedom of New York. And I remember it was in, she brought it back rather shamefacedly, and I remember the day she came back. So we were in a house in Wellington Street on the Bogside, and she arrived in to be greeted. I mean, she might have thought she was coming in. She said, "Great to have you back, Bernadette." And she arrived in, and I remember Mickey Doherty saying to her, "What the fuck were you doing in New York with that bastard Lindsay? You know, and why did you take this key?" And she was shamefaced about it. But then we had a brainwave. I was going out, I told you everybody was going out to America, a whole procession of people going out and shouting about Irish civil rights in the States to Irish Americans. So it was decided there and then that I would take the key to New York back out with me, and I would give it to the Black Panthers. Right. So I did this, and then I made a mistake because on the very first day I was there, some of my friends, Jimmy Breslin, who's a novelist in New York, a good friend of mine, says, "You're stupid, McCann, you're stupid. You don't do that on the first day, you do that on the last day." I said here, and he was probably right. But anyway, I did it on the first day, and I went to this place in Harlem where they had a headquarters or something, the Black Panthers, and I presented the key to a man called Robert Bay. Remember, he probably remembers, he was the Minister for Defence of the Black Panther Party. I don't know if that was just in New York or nationally, whatever. And I presented him with this key to New York in his little box and said, I made a little speech. You know, blah, blah, blah. New York is yours, it doesn't own to us. You own it, there's a freedom of New York, blah, blah, blah. Here's this symbolic thing. To my amazement, to everybody's amazement, this was on all the evening news programmes in the United States. It was a slightly unusual event. By 12 o'clock noon, the next day, I was due to do 13 meetings up the east coast of the United States. Every single one had been cancelled. Every single one. And what I'm talking about is this. All of these meetings have been organised by people who were passionate supporters of the civil rights movement in Ireland. They believed that it was wrong that Catholics should be discriminated against. But it never occurred to them, clearly had never occurred to them, that there was something to be read across from that to the situation in the United States. Indeed, they were actual racists. Many of them were racist. I remember being phoned from Boston by people I was staying with a guy called Bob Sincere. They were in New York, and the phone ringing off the hook. And one of the people from Boston, I won't repeat the actual words, but about 10 times the N-word was used about 10 times. I mean, that you're letting down the Irish people. You're compromising us. You're associating with those murdering N-words. Over again. And I learned a lesson from that about nationalism. I remember to this day about nationalism. Now, nationalism sort of the oppressed, I mean, there's this formula. And it's right, it's a good formula, sort of in the Marxist tradition, about there being a great difference between the nationalism of the oppressed and the nationalism of the oppressor. And that's absolutely right. Sort of, and we should remember that. Sort of, but as a fact, and sort of in terms of our bedrock basic beliefs, nationalism is a load of shit from a working class point of view. No matter where it's taken, nationalism is wrong. Nationalism invites people to identify themselves primarily with the nation that they come from, or that they imagine that they come from. All nations are imagined communities in the end. And that's not to deny sort of the power of Palestinian nationalism. Of course people are entitled fully to be who they are, to have the identity that is most congenial to them in the world. But as an ideology, nationalism binds classes together. Nationalism makes no distinction between men and women. Nationalism makes no distinction internally between races. Nationalism makes no distinction between the underpaid worker and the millionaire exploiter, which is why millionaire exploiters are very fond of nationalism. And Irish nationalism, as expressed in that incident, and I can give you others, incident. I'll give you another fact that comes to me. Emily, I think, he did mention Mumia Abu Jamal. As the Black Panther, he's now a long time, I don't know, I think it's over 30 years. He's been in prison where he was framed for killing a cop in Philadelphia. And then there's a cause celeb around the world. He faded a bit, and that's gone on for so long. So that you don't see his name in demonstrations anymore, but he's still there, still in prison. I can gather from what Emery was saying that he's in a prison hospital at the minute. I didn't know that until Emery said it. But a few years back, maybe 15 years ago, a friend of mine is a member of Sinn Féin, the Irish militant nationalist group in the north, arrived at my front door in the Bogside asking did I have any literature on Mumia. Because she was very pleased to say that she was going to the United States to visit somebody in Texas, but she was going via Philadelphia, and she was going to go, she had arranged to get into the prison to see Mumia Abu Jamal. There is a certain revolutionary chic cred to that type of thing. I'm not making little of it, but I mean, there is, that's terrific. We dug up a couple of pamphlets, gave them to her and so on. Then we discovered months later she hadn't visited him at all. She hadn't gone to Philadelphia. She hadn't gone to the prison to see Mumia. And the reason was this. The cop that had been framed for killing in Philadelphia was an Irish-American cop by the name of Flaherty. He's saying if she had gone to see the guy who had been framed for his killing, it would have done great damage to the Irish cause in Philadelphia and to the support that they had had from the police force in Philadelphia. So there you had an exact example of the way in which Irish nationalism destroyed any notion of internationalism, destroyed any sense of solidarity between the oppressed in one place and the oppressed in another. It repeated the same point, made the same lesson as I referred to. I was talking about meetings that I was due to speak at in the United States, all being cancelled very, very quickly. I see that everywhere. Maybe I'm obsessed with it. I come from, people would say, I come from the Bogside, in Derry, which is a large, working class Catholic area. And it's not an accident that the first civil rights movement march took place in Derry, because of the way that Derry Catholics, and that meant mainly in shorthand, the Bogsiders were being treated. I lived in a city where 2/3 of the population were Catholic, 1/3 was Protestant. Protestants, generally speaking, voted Unionist. Catholics, generally speaking, voted Nationalist, although I'll qualify that in a moment. But despite that, because of the manipulation of electoral boundaries and the way the franchise worked, in local government elections, you had to be a householder to have a vote. Only people who either were the named person who rented a house or who owned a house could vote. In vast numbers of people, and meant only one vote per house in that house, because you had to be the householder. And the way that works, differentially, it reduced the percentage of votes that Catholics could command. That combined sort of with the gerrymandering or the sort of discriminatory drawing of electoral boundaries, meant that 1/3 of the population could elect 2/3 of the local councillors. So that made Derry sort of a very obvious place where you could actually see discrimination against Catholics. You could sort of see it in the way elections work very clearly. You could literally draw maps of it, and many people did, and nationalist newspapers did. That was one of the reasons, not the only one, but it was one of the main reasons why the civil rights movement was originally sparked off in Derry. And the socio-economic implications of that. It wasn't just that people that you could look at the corporation, the local council, and see the way people were discriminated against. It all was, for example, in housing. In housing, the vast majority of social housing, or whatever it's called here, publicly funded housing, was made by the corporation, built houses, and allocated them. So if you wanted a house, you had to get the council to agree to give you a house. We had a wonderful, very simple system of allocating houses in Derry at that time. Was that every year, at the beginning of the council year, the council voted to give its housing allocation authority over to a subcommittee. The subcommittee would then be elected, 4 unionists and 2 nationalists. Always 4 unionists and 2 nationalists. It would meet once a year, and what it did was to vote its authority to allocate houses to the mayor. The mayor, one person, it was always a man, one person, the mayor, allocated the houses. And thus, the only way you could get a house, a social house, the only way you could get one was to convince the mayor that you should have one. And thus you had scenes. I can remember this. Standing in the corridor of the Guildhall, and somebody saying, a man called Albert Anderson, I remember this incident very well. Albert Anderson was the mayor, and it had been said to him, "Please, Mr. Anderson, we have been on the list for 21 years. And this guy standing there, and a big statue of Queen Victoria behind him. I can see it to this day, and I'm shaking his head. Sorry, there's nothing. Come back again." The humiliation of that burned into people, burned into me over that period. That's why, and that was in a city where 2/3 of the voters were not voting, were voting against this guy. He had the power to do that. And that explains why, and there's other reasons why. It's also to get a job. It helped if you wanted to get a job to be a member of the Orange Order, the gaudy, whatever, the ceremonial body that was associated with the Unionist Party in Northern Ireland. So wealth and power was associated with discrimination. One of the biggest employers in Derry at that time was a foundry, Brown's Foundry, in Foyle Street, near the city centre in Derry. And it was owned, as the name implies, a man called Brown. Mr. Brown was a unionist councillor when I was a kid. He also was a Grand Master of the Orange Order. So there was no Catholics working in Brown's Foundry. A couple of hundred people working, and never a Catholic. Even though it was literally within a stone's throw, as later we were to prove, of the Bogside area. So there you actually had it, So it wasn't a matter of just feeling that we were being humiliated in our social lives or something like that. It had a real material effect to do whether you worked and whether you had a decent house to live in. So that is why those things came together. The civil rights movement began not really as a movement to end anything other than the lack of housing and the lack of jobs. That's what was the spark of it. The key organisation was the Derry Housing Action Committee. It was a very small organisation. I was with 10 of us were members of it. When you look back on it now, it seems very significant, and I'm usually not one to correct you. If you imagine that it was a terribly significant mass organisation, we were great, weren't we? There was about a dozen eccentrics behind it, and we also had the Unemployed Action Committee, which we would go up and demonstrate outside the door when people were signing on for the social welfare, and all the rest of it. So that's where it was after housing agitation and occupying the council building, about housing and not about anything else, not asking even at that stage, we thought, because naive as this might sound, some of us had the idea at the time that if we concentrated on economic things, on jobs and houses, that would be a way of organising and rousing people in a way that didn't divide the community any more than it was already divided. Because it's important to remember that when we talk about discrimination against Catholics, it is not the case that every Protestant family was living well. Far from it. Far from it. Of course, there were masses of working-class Protestants, especially ones who did not have anybody in the Orange Order, who sort of bucked the system, and there were many of those, that decent Protestant trade unionists, who also were discriminated against. But by and large, sort of from the outside, you could understand sort of our city at that time as one in which there was discrimination based upon religion. Does that mean I have to go and have a hook on? Where was it? Oh, yes. So because one of the reasons we had that view, which can be described as naive, although there's more to it, and I hope if I get time, sort of, I'll explain why there was more to it, sort of than naivety. And one of the reasons I was involved, sort of, in this, we were not. When I say we came from a nationalist area, sort of Derry and the Bogside, but that wasn't as simple as that, as I said a few moments ago. So there are many people who are not nationalists by ideology. So this is always a complication when you're explaining sort of Northern Ireland. People say, well, you come from a nationalist background, don't you? So I say, well, yes, but I was never a nationalist. My father was never a nationalist. My father was the secretary of Derry Trade Union Council. I'm very pleased to be a member of that. My father was for many years, I forget how many years, but certainly from I knew when I was a kid. My father was a Labour man. He was never a left-wing socialist. My father was the type of guy who went to Mass every morning and communion. And in those days, we were proper Catholics in those days. In those days, you were not allowed to eat before you took Holy Communion in the morning. And if it was like my father, you went to Mass every morning before walking on to work. Went to 7 o'clock Mass, so he had no breakfast at all, not even a cup of tea. Very devout, sort of pious man. At the same time, he voted communist in union elections. I really did that. And he used to say sort of, he believed sort of in the left. He was never a communist, sort of in the sense of being a party man. Indeed, there was no communist party in Derry to be sort of associated with. But it was sort of, it was the Catholic Church for salvation in the next world, and socialism for salvation in this world. Sort of, and he didn't see any distinction between these two things. But one of his proudest boasts was, and he used to say this, my family can boast that there never was a nationalist vote went out of this house. And he was right, we never voted nationalist. My mother never voted nationalist. My Aunt Sophie, who was the only other member of that generation in our family who lived in Derry, never voted nationalist. We were Labour people. There always was a Labour candidate who always lost. I remember them, Jim Quinn, Stephen McGonigal, and people sort of who were names forgotten by history. They were the Labour candidates who came up. And there were always a few people like my father who faithfully went out and voted for them to make the point that they weren't nationalists. So that was one of the reasons why somebody like myself would have been more inclined to join something that was based on housing and based on work, that certainly of them was based on nationalism, or the idea of a united Ireland. We would have said we want a united Ireland. Yes, my father would have said I want a united Ireland. He would have gone on immediately to curse the state in Southern Ireland as a capitalist hellhole as well. And they say that when we're finished with this place, we start on that bastard down there. Actually, he would never have used the word bastard, my father. He was a very quiet-spoken man. So, but he was that sort of a sort of Labour person, sort of from a Catholic working-class area, feeling that discrimination, but fighting against the idea, sort of that in reaction to that, you must bind together all those of a nationalist frame of mind, sort of whatever their class position was. I remember actually that some election, forget when it was, probably in the 1950s, sort of when I would have been a teenage hooligan running around the Bogside. I remember an eve of poll meeting that had been held for the candidacy of a Mr. Eddie McAteer. Eddie was the leader of the Nationalist Party, sort of, and the MP for Derry for as long as I could remember, and for as long as he wanted to be, it appeared, sort of at that time. And we didn't sort of select nationalist candidates. They were sort of anointed by the church. Sort of, the nationalist candidate, the priest would tell everybody, you got to vote for Mr. McAteer, to stand up for Catholic, blah, 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 all that nonsense. I remember this meeting, eve of poll rally on a place called Cable Street in the Bogside. And there's this businessman, one of Mr. McAteer's sidekicks, James O'Doherty. He owned a string of butcher's shops, famous for his sausages, Doherty sausages. And he was making this speech to people about why everybody must turn out in the morning, sort of to vote for Eddie McAteer. And somebody shouted something about jobs and houses. And he said, I remember to this day, he said, we don't want their jobs and houses, we want our freedom. Oh. And that was the line. So that tells you all that you need to know, really, about Irish nationalism and about nationalism sort of anywhere. Stuff, we'll live in hovels as long as we're free. So that when we came to the civil rights movement, sort of that, sort of was all that sort of was in our heads, or certainly in my head. And when I stood up on October the 5th, 1968, sort of, and made the speech and responded to Mickey Devine and so on. But I had in mind, and what many other people sort of had in mind who were in the civil rights movement, was not that we were on the verge of a great romantic struggle or fight for a united Ireland. So we believed sort of that we were on the verge sort of a great struggle, romantic and realistic, for a new world, for a world sort of in which we saw, the class relationships transform. World in which sort of we believed sort of that we were part of something not was huge in Irish history, although that would have been a reasonable thought as well. We're part of something huge, we believe, that was happening all over the world. That is why we related to the Black Panthers. That is why we didn't want Bernadette associating with Mayor John Lindsay, that we wanted her actually to associate herself with the Panthers and with the black struggle sort of in the United States. Because remember, we're talking 1968. We're talking the era of the anti-Vietnam War movement. We're talking about civil rights sort of in the United States. We're talking about the Prague Spring. So I remember sort of when the Prague Spring was on, a couple of us going down, this is how naive we actually were at the time. We sent a telegram to the GPO in Prague, wishing them solidarity and all the best. I've often wondered, there must have been some poor schmuck sort of in a post office sort of in Prague, and he gets this telegram from the people of the Bogside to the people of Prague. Fight on, we are with you. But we did actually believe that loads of people, and it was right. Beware, so all these, most of them, there was, sort of the Rudi Dutschke in Berlin, sort of Daniel Cohn-Bendit, sort of Danny the Red, sort of in Paris. These names probably mean nothing to people anymore. Young people today. But anyway, sort of it's these were great heroes at the time. Actually, those names that Emery was mentioning, we knew those names. We knew Fred Hampton. We knew Stokely Carmichael. We knew Bobby Hutton. We knew Bobby Seale. I can remember when Bobby Hutton got murdered in Oakland. We knew as soon as that happened, when the news came through, we sensed that had something to do with us. So when all those great heroes sort of the fight sort of for equality, sort of an anti-imperialism in the United States and the rest of it. So it wasn't crazy, sort of ideas. Those ideas sort of that came in a sort of moderate and subdued and muted way from my father, sort of in which infused the beliefs of some of us at the beginning of the civil rights movement. Sort of all those sort of were connected with the idea sort of that a success, that revolution in Northern Ireland, the overthrow of the state, was not something on its own, sort of which was separated from everywhere else, that we weren't exceptional, that nowhere is exceptional, nobody is exceptional, sort of that we're all the same, we're all the one, and that we must rise up together. That seemed, again, that probably looks naive now. There was a moment in the late 1960s when that seemed like no more than common sense. And that's something to hold on to. I've always held on to. I know that this can happen again because it happened before. And that's the most valuable lesson I've ever learned in my political life, which I keep trying to spread. And there was I don't know if it was a moment ago, as I walked up here, I saw there's a representation of a Free Derry wall, sort of which it says you're now entering Free Derry. It's so popular now. They sell them in shops in Derry. It's a terrible. I don't object to tourists coming to Derry. The more the better. I think it's a lovely town. They should come and actually see it. But people come over all the time, from all around the world, and they parade through the place. And there's no guides taking them through the Bogside. Bogside's an ordinary working class neighbourhoods where I come from, where I still live. When you see these sort of parties of 10, 15, 20 people, guides pointing out that this happened and that happened. There's only one more still, the city walls of Derry, sort of overlook the Bogside. Walls from the 17th century. It's one of only two remaining sort of walled cities in the whole of Europe. I want you to know that. It's very distinctive. We're very proud of that. I'm very proud of that. I like that. They were connected way back to the 17th century. But we're only one step away from them taking tourists up the Derry city walls, Derry walls, sort of asking them to look down on the bog side, and have us all dressed in traditional costume, so that you can see the bogsiders in their natural habitat. They're one step away from that. The way sort of struggle sort of is sentimentalised and commercialised in time. Right. What was I? Oh yes, Free Derry Wall. You're now entering Free Derry. Now, if you look at that, I bet you, if you, insofar as you've noticed it at all, come up by .com will be gone. We're hoping to be able to point to it. But anyway, sort of it's, you probably think it says you're now entering Free Derry. And that's to do with there it is. You're now entering Free Derry. Gable Wall. It just look an awful lot better when it was just scrawled. With a paintbrush. So then they came along, sometime the Provost Sinn Féin came along eventually, and decided that we must be neat and clean and well advised. Sort of, and have these things sort of done like that. And you can get little replicas of it, sort of in the shops, sort of souvenirs. Which is pretty shocking, sort of, if you're like me, you remember it going up. But anyway, sort of, you might think, most people would think, looking at that it's got something to do with freeing Ireland, that's what it's about. And if that's what people think it's about, that's okay as well. And if that's what even the majority of people in Derry now have come to regard it as, that's all right. I mean, slogans mean what the majority of people that they're aimed at and expressed on behalf of what they think it means. I've got no problem with that. Meanings change over time. But what it actually meant in the beginning was this. That slogan had nothing to do originally, except implicitly or perhaps semi-subconsciously. But it didn't have anything to do. It wasn't put up to refer to Irish freedom at all. It was actually taken from Berkeley College in California, where in the early 1960s or mid-1960s, there was a thing known as the Berkeley Free Speech Movement. Berkeley is a strange place, very interesting, entrancing place, Berkeley. It's always been a centre of free speech. Berkeley has been one strange thing about Berkeley and Berkeley College is this, that most places, the university takes its name from the town. Like the Melbourne University, I'm sure, well, there are 4 of them, I understand. More than one of them are Cambridge University, or, sort of a University of California in Los Angeles. I mean, the university takes its name from the town. Berkeley, the town, took its name from the university. The university was named after a man called Bishop Berkeley. Bishop Berkeley was an 18th century guy, great thinker, Bishop Berkeley. He's an Anglican. He was, believe it or not, one of the jobs that he had was as Dean of Derry, Bishop Berkeley. Bishop Berkeley then sort of went to a bit of a wanderer. And actually, it's doubtful if he ever spent any time at all in Derry. In those days, sort of the dean or the bishop of a place, it was sort of an appointment, a grace and favour appointment. It didn't actually require you to conduct services or anything like that. And as far as I can tell, Berkeley never fancied Derry very much. But apart from that, he was a good man. And one of the things that he did, he was in the West Indies, in Barbados. And one of the things he did was that he founded 2 colleges. And he wanted a college founded, before he died, he wanted a college founded, sort of in California. And one of his stipulations about the college is that it must admit Native Americans. Now that might sound like an ordinary thing, if it does sound like an ordinary thing. At its time, it was an absolutely revolutionary idea. The idea that Native Americans would be able to attend university, was unthought of. Berkeley was a rationalist. A very advanced thinker in his day. He was abreast of the most advanced thinking in Europe before he headed off to the West Indies. And they called the college after him. The college wasn't built in his lifetime. It was built in the early part of the 19th century. And a group of people, I've seen the minutes of the meeting, mainly business people, met, and a few academics, in San Francisco, and talked about what they called the new university college that they were intending to build, about 30 miles, whatever it is, outside San Francisco, and coming up with the idea, of calling it after Bishop Berkeley. Incidentally, Bishop Berkeley, Google him, get the wiki, to read him. He's a wonderful writer as well, wonderful writer about liberty and all, strange things, for an Anglican dignitary of that period to have been writing. But it was always a centre of free speech and free thinking because of that, because of the nature of its founding. It was where the beatniks concentrated in the 1950s. If you look at the first edition, City Lights edition of Allen Ginsberg's great poem, Howl, and I just pass on because if I get on to Howl, I start reciting bits of it, as it's my favourite poem of all time. We recite it every year. You have a thing at Pride Week, gay pride. Because Ginsberg, of course, was a fighter for gay liberation, before the idea became fashionable. So Ginsberg was there, and at the end of the City Lights edition of it, it just says Allen Ginsberg, Berkeley, 1956. So it's there, and Kerouac sort of wrote a lot of his stuff, sort of holed up down there, sort of in this strange little town built around the University of Berkeley. And in the 1960s, they had sort of the free speech movement, a man called Dominic Savio. A few of that's the only name that I remember, and this thing. And they were fighting for free speech within the university, sort of, and that meant sort of that their courses shouldn't be constricted. They should be able to study whatever that they wanted. That anybody with any ideas or philosophy should be able to come in and teach, sort of, and lecture, sort of, in the university. Sort of, and they had a large sit-in, 1963, 64, sort of, whatever it was, and some of us had spotted, sort of, outside the college, a little photograph, sort of a sign at the entrance at the time they had it occupied for free speech, and it said, "You are now entering free Berkeley." That's where that slogan comes from. Sort of, when it was put up there, sort of early in the morning of the 5th of January, 1969, that's exactly the time at about 2:30 in the morning. So that's exactly the time it was put up. That's what it was about. It was about expressing something which had come from the other side of the United States, from all those, from so far away, and to do with something that was different, but expressed the notion, sort of, as Mickey Devine's shouting about the Mexican Olympics had expressed, that what we were about in Northern Ireland was part of something global, was part of something that referred to the whole of humanity, and not just to the particular provincial grievances, deep and real as they were, sort of our people, sort of there in Northern Ireland. So when I look back on it now, when I look back, I said this to somebody just earlier today, when I look back on that whole period, of course there's loads of things that I regret. Sort of, and somebody asked me last night, is there anything you would have done differently? Now, I would have done everything differently if I'd known then, sort of, what I know now. And of course that's the case, you know, and if you don't learn from mistakes, sort of, just persist in believing that you were right, good lesson in this for all of us, so you're never actually going to get anywhere. You're never going to develop and enrich your understanding, sort of, and put yourself in a position of being able to contribute to the overthrow of the world we live in today, as opposed to a caricature world, sort of, which we might have in our minds. So that's what I remember, sort of, and that's the lesson I take from those days, and it's the lesson I take from these days as well. And when I recall, sort of, Mayor Daley, sort of, in Chicago, Mayor John Lindsay in the United States those days, and the attitudes, sort of Irish Americans, it reminds me today, what it reminds me of is all those Irish alleged revolutionaries who strut over to the United States on Paddy's Day every year. I mean, they go off in their best bibs and tuckers, sort of, to crawl their way, sort of, up the steps to the White House. It never occurs to them that where they should be is in Ferguson, Missouri, talking to people who are like ourselves, who share our position, and whose liberation depends upon our liberation. So all those issues, so much has changed. The world has changed, and technology has changed. Sort of the outlines, sort of the parameters, sort of the shape of struggle, of course, changes over time, from year to year, decade to decade, and from place to place. But some things stay the same. And one of the things that stays the same is that none of us can be free until everybody is free. It is the simplest piece, sort of political wisdom that lies at the very heart of Marxism, sort of, which we must constantly keep in mind. Whatever struggle we are fighting, any struggle, whether it's to do with gender or skin colour, sort of, our national rights, or economic rights, or environmental rights, or any of them, none of them will be won until all of them are won. And that is the case for revolutionary socialist politics, as opposed to any other brand of politics. Thanks very much.